Yes, as they said, I am currently in Missoula, Montana, but I started my career at NARF in 1994 through 2004. So as Melody did indicate, I was the first attorney on the project. I was asked to come and talk a little bit about the history and how we started, which, looking out, I may get a little tearful. It started a little bit like this. We started on September 11th, the September 11th. We were at the Hyatt Hotel here in D.C. Thankfully, we were in the basement. The conference room was in the basement. And it started like this. The seats were filled, the panelists were up here, and Senator Inouye came on stage and told us that a plane had hit the tower. And at that point, in my head, I thought, what kind of bad driver do you have to be to hit one of those towers? I mean, when you sat at the bottom of the tower and you looked up, they were, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember them, they were frighteningly tall. They were so big. And we continued on. I mean, that was odd. But a couple minutes later, he came back in and said, a second tower has been hit. And it was pandemonium, as you can imagine. And also, for those of you who are old enough to remember, this was pre-cell phone days. I mean, some of us had a little flip phone, but pre-internet. We were getting our news as speakers came on the stage and updated us. And at the time, I'm sure all of you probably know, John Echohawk was our rock, and said, we're safe, well, which I want to say, there was still a plane in the air. And many of us wanted to leave, and John assured us we were safe and that we could continue, and we did. And despite, I mean, we recognized the tragedy and fear and horror that was, but at the same time, Indian country was also experiencing its own tragedy and horror. The United States Supreme Court was not just chipping away, but gouging away at tribal sovereignty. And so that day we had come to meet, it was an emergency meeting to try to see what Indian country could do to stave off this destruction of tribal sovereignty. It was a 4-point plan, one of the points being this idea of a tribal Supreme Court project. Now, we had a speaker, he's been a bedrock of this project for the 25 years it's been in existence, Riaz Kanji. He had been a clerk for one of the Supreme Court justices. He was interested in what could be done, and he had looked at some other examples, the main example being the state's attorneys general had decided some years prior that they maybe needed some help before the United States Supreme Court. They decided that the best way to improve their advocacy would be to form a coalition of attorneys general. So the idea here was to coalesce Indian country to improve our advocacy in front of the United States Supreme Court. In a nutshell, the goal at that point was to improve the win-loss record. At that point, every time a Native American tribe, almost every time a Native American tribe went to the United States Supreme Court, either as the petitioner, meaning they had lost before and were asking the Supreme Court to relook at the case, or as the respondent, meaning they had won below, and the United States, or usually the United States, was asking the Supreme Court to overturn that decision, they lost. 80% of the time, Indian tribes lost in front of the United States Supreme Court. And to give you an idea of how actually bad those numbers were, if you were a convicted criminal and you were seeking to have your conviction overturned in front of the Supreme Court, you had a better chance than an Indian tribe did of winning. And so Riaz got up and gave this idea, and as Melody indicated, I was the attorney who was then tasked with putting this idea into practice. And so yesterday, as she said, we were doing filming talking about the history, and the question was, well, how did you know what to do? And my answer was, I did not know what to do. At that point, I had done a fair amount of briefing and advocacy in front of the Supreme Court and the lower courts as amicus curiae. Now, what that means is an amicus brief is a brief that's filed by they're not parties to the action, but they are tribes or individuals who are going to be impacted by whatever case the United States Supreme Court is reviewing. So I had been doing this, but at that time, the way we had gone about it, and it was piecemeal. Multiple tribes might file briefs, attorneys might file briefs, we were filing briefs, but there was no cohesion. So one of the first goals of the project was to get us together and refine our arguments, limit the number of briefs that were going up. Because if 20, 30 briefs were going up, and these were extras, these were not the principal briefs in chief, it was unclear even if the Supreme Court was reading those briefs, or were they duplicitous, were we just saying the same thing over and over, and what was the impact of that? And so our first task was to get together and decide, look, we're going to make a concerted effort. We're going to get together and brainstorm and together make these arguments in as few and well-crafted briefs as possible. So we started that with, as I explained, I flipped through my Rolodex, got on my phone that was attached by a string to the wall, and started calling people. And the reception was overwhelming. I think the time for this project was long overdue, and the idea was just a good one. Get together and let's fight this together. And as I said, the response was overwhelming. Practitioners, specialists, tribal leaders devoted their time and resources just endlessly to what was needed. And within just the first 2 years, we saw a turnaround. We saw that we were making a difference. That first term, 3 cases went up. The one the project was most heavily involved in was a case called White Mountain Apache. It questioned whether the tribes could sue the United States government for, they had taken control over Indian property, had turned it into an Indian school, and just let it fall into rack and ruin, allegedly it being held in trust for the tribes. And the tribe said, well, you're trying to give this back and you've destroyed it. And the government said, well, you know, that's how that goes. And the United States Supreme Court said, no, that is not how that goes. You held this in trust, you had a duty and an obligation to maintain it, and the tribes won.
Very good.
So now that brief, as I will say, we were still small, we were still staffed by one attorney, I wrote that brief, but by the second case that came up, a case called the United States versus Billy Joe Lara. Billy Joe Lara was a non-member Indian who lived on the Spirit Lake Reservation. He was a troublemaker, and he was causing problems, and to the extent that the tribe had exercised its most egregious remedy, it excluded him from the reservation. But Billy Joe Lara didn't listen. He came back, and altercations ensued. He knocked out a police officer, and the tribe prosecuted him. Now, as you know, the tribes have only misdemeanor jurisdiction, meaning, I think at that time it was a year, possibly still 6 months. I'm sorry if I don't recall. But they prosecuted him and sentenced him. The officer he had struck was a BIA officer, so later on the United States said, we want to prosecute him as well. And he said, no, that's double jeopardy. This is where the tribes are just part of the federal government. That's where their authority comes from. And the question was, do tribes have inherent authority to prosecute non-member Indians? And as you may or may not know, the Supreme Court had come down already and said, no, you do not have that. You do not have that power. Congress acted and said, recognize. No, we meant that tribes, we are recognizing that tribes have inherent power to exercise jurisdiction over non-member Indians within their reservations, on their territory. And the difference this time, now as I say, the first brief was just me, but the second brief, we had practitioners, specialists writing each of the parts, and we were able to give that court such a picture of what was going on in Indian country that it was undeniable what needed to happen, and it did. We won again.